If we know one thing, it is that a bad economy is bad for everybody. And if you want to fix your life, you need to fix your finances. Now, the short version that will be sufficient for pretty much everybody is make industry record rupees in your rural course, and they can add propaganda sentences to any resource production province that has a target amount of under 100%. Thank you, like and subscribe. However, for the people that, really care about that extra little tiny bit of efficiency, lock in. Because we're gonna go deep and look at some numbers and spreadsheets that will keep any girlfriend at a healthy distance. So if you build a level 1 industry in one of your core CTVPs, it will increase resource production by 13% and cost you 3,000 resources. So if we assume that your province has a morale of 100% and we ignore the gradual resource increase during its build time, we get an amortization or payback time of just under 4 days. And then if we look at the following levels of industry, we see that their additional resource generation increases with each level, but also do their costs. What we really care about, however, is the amortization. And while there are some small differences, they are all largely around the 4-day mark. So an industry level that finishes on day 4 will have paid itself off at day 8. So personally, considering that my games on big maps usually have their biggest and most game-deciding fights and battles fairly late into the game, maybe around day 12 or 16 or 20, it does suggest that building industry in core VPs is a complete no-brainer. And I would only temporarily halt industry production if I expect to fight a strong opponent within 2 days. Now, rural industry is slightly different, but overall still pretty similar. Apparently the first level is a little bit less efficient. But another thing to note about the difference between urban and rural resource production is that every country on a balanced map spawns in the constellation where whatever resource they only have 1 VP of, they get 4 rural provinces of that resource instead of only 1. And while this makes a slight difference on day 1, due to non-industrialized urban provinces being more efficient than non-industrialized rural provinces. But if you max everything out, your economy should basically be perfectly balanced. Now, the base resource generation is not always the same, and I didn't open new games on every map just to test it, but I know that on the 100 player map, 4x speed has only 75% of the resource generation that the normal map has, which does make sense considering that people will usually be less active on a 4x speed map, at least in relation to the time that passes. But still, on paper, industry has a higher amortization time under these conditions, but this should largely be negligible, considering that in the 4x speed game you will probably spend 1 to 1.5 days sleeping. Making industry is still overall more attractive in a speed map than a normal map. And then another major thing for economy, and which most people should already be aware of, is that there is a massive difference between core territory and non-core territory. Non-core territory generates resources at only 25% efficiency. However, if you would decide to build industry in these non-core provinces, you would still pay full price for those, and therefore our amortization time also is 4 times higher. As we can see, 15 to 20 days of payback time is a lot. Now, considering that my games rarely go past 20 days, in general, this is just clearly not worth it. But there are some situations where we can look at it a little bit differently. If you happen to play the game in a similar way as me, you will usually find yourself floating a lot of steel in mid and late game. So you might ask yourself the question, how would it influence our payback time if we would ignore the steel costs? And then we are basically only at around 8 to 10 days, which is still high all things considered, and only worth it if you feel like the game is really gonna go late. But especially if you really want to play a very oil heavy build, for example combining a strong air force with fast artillery stacks, maybe using some food and steel to increase resource production in your rural oil provinces would be your best option. And then another, sort of economy building is the propaganda center. Now, resource generation scales sort of linear with province morale. So whenever you expand too quickly and you start having morale issues, I think you should always immediately build propaganda centers in industrialized core provinces, pretty much the moment they go under 100% morale. But I mean, other than that, you mostly want to use propaganda centers to help with unit production speed. And if you capture high-level industries in tech, you can also add high-level propaganda centers there too. But building propaganda centers just to boost resource production in like MTVPs is just not that great. And especially for rural, it's like a big no-go. Now, ideally, you would get some extra efficiency late game if you would make your production facilities in the same VPs of the resource that you are bottlenecked in, so that you build your propaganda centers for the unit production speed and the extra resources is like a bonus. So I personally would always prefer that bonus to be oil and not steel late game. But yeah, I mean, all in all, economy is good in core and only viable in non-core in very niche situations. And in core, you always want to aim for a maxed out economy. And I often see like people randomly stop at like level 3 industry in their core VPs, and this just makes no sense to me. And another thing I can tell you that in the early game of a new match, as like both urban and rural forms of industry are heavy in steel, and many other units that I make in the early game are usually heavy in steel, like the armored car and the rocket artillery, usually steel is the bottleneck. So in the start of the game, I will usually build urban industry and rural steel industry first. And that's it. And have fun maxing out your industry.